Okay, we are live. So, hi everyone. My name is Madeline Dyer, and I'm joined by Kit Mallory. And we're very excited to be having this conversation because, we've discussed this a little bit beforehand, and mental health in speculative fiction is something that we're both really interested in. So, yeah, firstly, should we just introduce ourselves? So, Kit, do you want to go first and just introduce yourself and what you write and why writing mental health representation into your books is really important for you?
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm Kit Mallory. I'm a YA author and I write speculative fiction. I have one book out at the moment, which is a near future dystopia set in the UK, which is unsettlingly becoming more like reality day by day, which is so not what I hoped would happen when I started writing it. So I have one book out, it's called Blackout. The sequel is coming very soon. I write I write LGBT fiction, so my writing has queer leads, and as everything I write inevitably kind of comes back to mental health, and I think I just kind of can't not, like, it just sort of happens. I think when you're writing kind of three-dimensional characters and putting them in difficult situations, I don't know about you, but it kind of just sort of evolves naturally from there. I think one of the most interesting things about putting characters in challenging situations is how they deal with that, and the struggles and the challenges, and how that kind of interacts with their backstory. I think it's really, really, really important to have books that aren't just about one issue. So, books about, people who are LGBT or people who have mental health problems that aren't just about them dealing with that one issue, because people's lives aren't ever just about one issue. I think it's really important that everyone can see that they can be like the hero of their own story. Yeah, that's me. Tell me about you. Tell me about your writing and your books.
Okay, yeah. So, I also write YA dystopian. So I've got the Untamed series out, which is now a complete series. It's 4 books, and yeah, there's a lot of mental health representation in that series. And when I started writing it, I wasn't expecting that to happen, but it just sort of evolved organically, and it was just part of these characters. And I suppose if you're writing about such a terrifying world that's really challenging and testing, it is only natural it's going to be extremely stressful. And obviously stress is one thing that can cause mental illness to sort of surface if you're not sort of aware that it's there before, or it can cause it to start with. So I think that it is kind of natural to include sort of mental illness and mental health disorders in dystopian fiction, especially. So yeah, my protagonist, she struggles with addiction in my Untamed series, and that's mainly to do with the world building, because I knew right from the start that addiction was going to be in it, because it's about a world in which sort of you've got these elite human beings, and they encourage addiction as a way to sort of control everyone around them, and they can sort of control people through making them addicted to certain things. So it's very much bound up in power and politics. So although I knew that addiction would be sort of a mental health focus in the story, I didn't sort of anticipate that my characters would then go on to develop severe anxiety disorders, there's PTSD as well, and then psychosis does come up in the 4th book as well. But yeah, it all just sort of developed naturally as I got to know the characters and worked out sort of how they would react to the stress, and it is just such a stressful environment. And I think that dystopian fiction is a great place to explore mental health in particular, because it shows that it is sort of a normal part of human process, really, and part of humanity, and it is a natural thing to happen. I think that it's just so important to normalize mental illness, and particularly in YA fiction, because that's where a lot of teenagers who may just be starting to experience mental illness might go to sort of find characters who look like themselves, and who feel the same things that they do. So then if they can find a character who is struggling with mental illness but is also managing to sort of be this amazing figure in a dystopian society, and still leading change and bringing about the change that's needed, it just makes a really positive role model, and it doesn't show that mental illness necessarily has to be a bad thing. So I think that's what really sort of like motivated me in the end to sort of like make mental health such a strong focus in my series. And yeah, like at the moment I've moved on to sort of writing more contemporary works, and I'm just really concentrating on the mental health and mental illness side, and getting accurate representation in the books as well, because like that is sort of like my big goal at the moment. But yeah, so why would you think that it is like especially important to explore mental health in the speculative fiction genres rather than just in like contemporary fiction?
I think it's I kind of feel like how almost like how can you, if you're putting your characters in really kind of stressful traumatic situations, how can you write realistic characters without, I think often mental health problems are a kind of normal and understandable reaction to an extraordinary situation, and I think that you kind of have to take account of that. I think you're right that obviously there are all kinds of triggers and all kinds of factors that lead to people developing mental illness, but it just feels like it would be really weird, doesn't it, if you had like none of your characters had a mental health problem, because so many people do at some point during their lives. And actually, I quote this statistic all the time: half of lifetime mental illness starts by the age of 14. So when you're writing YA, a lot of those characters are already going, in real life they would already be contending with the stuff, with these vulnerabilities, with these experiences. And I think you made a really good point about kind of the importance of people being able to see themselves reflected in fiction, and I think that's absolutely true. I think that it's really important for people to be able to see that you can thrive even if you struggle with your mental health. You can still achieve amazing things. You can still have a life that's worth living. I think it's really important. I think the beauty of fiction is partly in being able to see yourself reflected in other people, but also in being able to kind of picture yourself somewhere else, and maybe giving some hope to people that if you're struggling, then it doesn't always have to be that way. I think it feels really important.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I agree with you completely, because like we do need to sort of talk more about mental health, and the more representation that we have in fiction of it, the more we do sort of like say this is a normal part of the human experience, and hopefully then it will get more people talking. So it will sort of raise awareness of these different types of mental illnesses and mental health disorders. And like I know particularly with obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a lot of misinformation out there and sort of like public about what it actually is. And through having sort of like these representations of like OCD in fiction, it is just really helpful, because it just combats all the like these stereotypes that are really harmful. And like from my sort of like personal perspective, because I have OCD and psychosis as a result of brain inflammation, and before sort of like I was really aware of particularly the representation of psychosis in fiction, I'd only really seen it portrayed as a bad thing, where psychosis was something that the villain had, and it was just sort of like used as an extra characteristic to make them more evil. And that just like it really got to me, because then when I was then diagnosed with psychosis and I was like getting all these hallucinations, I just kind of felt I needed to find sort of a positive role model in fiction that I could then relate to. And it would have helped me a lot if I had been able to find one. And I wouldn't perhaps have felt as much shame about being diagnosed with this and being given this label that is stereotypically given to sort of like an evil villain character. So yeah, I think it's really important to explore mental health, like in all fiction. But yeah, looking at the speculative fiction genres in particular, what I really love about sort of like exploring sort of mental illness in these characters and those sort of books is that it's not usually sort of the main focus of the story, and you've got like this amazing world building. You've got sort of like the characters got like this overall goal that is different to sort of like their mental illness. So but you can see how their mental illness does impact their actions and how they go about achieving a goal. But it also shows that like this goal is still attainable and that the illness isn't something that is automatically going to stop you. So yeah, but like I know sort of it's just something that I'm really I really want to find more YA, especially YA speculative fiction that does deal with mental health, because it is just so important. And even if it's not sort of like the main focus of the storyline, like I love it when you've just got like these minor characters who you can clearly see have these like mental illnesses, and the author doesn't make a big thing of it, because I think that's really important, and just to sort of show that it's not like always a huge thing, but you can sort of see that several people in a story are likely to have it, because like as you were saying, it is quite a common thing. And I think if you're going to sort of include one mental illness in a story where you've got like about 30 or 40 characters, it's quite likely that there's going to be more than one mentally ill character. So yeah, I think it's really important to sort of like reflect sort of real life in these scenarios. And speculative fiction is all about like asking the reader to sort of suspend belief in a way, and you don't want them to like suspend belief too much, because you need to sort of bring in things that they can relate to in their world. And yeah, mental health is just like it's a really good thing to include. So yeah,
I think you touched on something really interesting there about that kind of feeling of shame that you can that comes with kind of feeling like you're the only person who's had that experience, or it's such an isolating thing, the nature of that emotion. And the antidote to shame is, in kind of sharing and openness and having shared experiences. And you're right, it's such a kind of fundamental it's such a fundamental need, I think, to be able to see, to know that you're not on your own, that you're just a human like other humans. And I think that's the kind of magic of fiction, is that humans are human in all settings and all experiences, and there is kind of ultimately sort of more that connects us than divides us. And I think it's an amazing thing to be able to see that, I think, and to know that. I think being sort of reading something that you connect with and you see yourself reflected, it makes you feel like you're being held in mind by somebody else, like you're not isolated. And I think, certainly. I think, I've sort of definitely had that experience in terms of kind of seeing kind of queer representation in fiction as well. When I was like growing up, like queer YA was not a thing whatsoever. And it really does contribute to making you feel, to whether you feel like who you are as a person is okay or not okay, and whether people will understand you, and whether and accept you. And I think for me, feeling like I could do even like a small part, I think, to help somebody feel seen or understood, I think is kind of what it's all about, really.
Yeah, exactly. Like I agree, like completely. So yeah, it just really is important. And what you're saying about how it's all about showing like what the human experience is about, and that being like having mental illness is like a natural part of being human. I think that links in really well with dystopian fiction, actually, because dystopian fiction, like a lot of it boils down to sort of like looking at humanity and what like the human experience is and what humans are capable of. So yeah, in terms of your book, do you just like tell us a little bit more about how mental health comes into your dystopian world?
Sure. So Blackout is a sort of rough kind of explanation of the setting. So it's set in a version of the UK where kind of fuel and electricity is starting to kind of run out, and a totalitarian government have taken over, not at all like our current government. And the government have sort of decided to solve this problem of not having enough resources to go around by building a wall across the middle of the country and essentially cutting off the north of the country, and any northerner who is kind of in the south illegally is kind of not considered a person, basically, sort of risking execution. And it's about these two teenagers from the north who are illegally in the south, and one of them steals an encrypted flash drive from the government headquarters, and shenanigans ensue, basically. So I mean, and these two characters are kind of 16, 17 years old, and they've both been through kind of, huge, sort of huge kind of traumatic loss in some ways the same, in some ways different. So one of the characters has developed quite severe OCD, which kind of manifests in a kind of sort of real sense of responsibility for safety, and particularly the safety of other people, and kind of partly around contamination, but partly just around kind of, I have to, if there are people I care about, I have to make sure that they're safe, and it really kind of takes over his life at points in the book. And the other character, I suppose I feel kind of comfortable kind of labeling Mackenzie's experience as OCD. I think the other main character, Skylar, her I don't know that I would kind of label her with a diagnosis as such, but I think she has a lot of kind of features of somebody who has been through kind of an enormous amount of trauma and has had to kind of adapt to living in a kind of consistently kind of traumatic and frightening and threatening environment over a long period of time, and that has affected the way that she kind of experiences and regulates her emotions. So yeah, and in the sequel there is a I don't want to give too much away, but there's a viewpoint character who has I suppose again what I would comfortably classed as kind of PTSD. So there's I suppose a range of experiences, but yeah, I think it all of it comes back to kind of having lived under sort of extreme stress for a long period of time, and for some people there are kind of specific incidents that are kind of particularly sort of resonant. For some people it's more about kind of cumulative sort of experience of that, as I think it is the case for lots of humans. So yeah, does that make sense? Have I answered the question?
Yeah, you do raise like an interesting point there, actually. Like, do you think it's important for us to sort of like label the mental illnesses that we're writing into our characters, to like give a definite diagnosis? Because I know in my series, I specifically say that like one character has diagnosis, and like I do mention sort of like the addiction, obviously, and like the anxiety, but I was just thinking sort of like with the characters in my story that exhibit like the clear PTSD, there's no sort of like definite label given to them and no diagnosis given. And yeah, I was just wondering what your views on that is, like whether it's absolutely necessary to sort of like label characters, particularly in a dystopian world, when we might definitely don't have access to like a medical team and like psychiatrists and doctors who are like there for their mental health. So yeah, like there is that balance between like keeping it realistic to the world building, and like whether you would have access to this information. But do you think it's important for readers to definitely know which like illnesses and disorders we are writing about?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think when it comes to kind of labeling it in the book, in the narrative, I think you're right. I think it's very much about the kind of the character's kind of subjective experience of it, and whether they understand their difficulties in that way, whether they have that kind of conception of their experience, and whether they have the vocabulary to go with it that we have. And I don't think that all of everybody necessarily would, and certainly I don't think that the kind of characters that all of the characters in Blackout do. I think the most important thing is about the kind of like sort of fidelity to the experience, the kind of description of the experience, and I think that's much more important than just saying a character has a disorder. I think it's in the most important thing, really, is in the depiction of it, and that being kind of accurate and kind of true, and resonating with readers, I think. And that's always been much more important to me. And I think certainly in my writing there are instances where perhaps another character will label a character with a disorder or a diagnosis, but like the character who is experiencing it doesn't necessarily agree or experiencing it in the same way. So what do you think? Do you think it's do you think it's important to have those kind of definitive labels?
Yeah, so like on the one hand, like if I'm reading a character in a book and they're sort of like displaying to me clear signs of OCD, which I have personal experience of, and I'm like relating to this character, in a way I do want the author to sort of like acknowledge that it is OCD, because some readers might think it is just like a general anxiety disorder, because there is a lot of like there's a lot of misinformation about like what makes up these particular disorders. So on the one hand, I do think it would be very useful from like an information point of view that if like these disorders are always labelled, but from like a world building point of view and from a plot point of view, it wouldn't always be natural to the book to be able to like include this information. Because so like in my dystopian series, I've got like it's about a group of characters on the run basically, and they're very much shaped by their experiences, but they don't have access to any sort of healthcare, so it would be completely unnatural for the setting if suddenly I found a way to like diagnose like one of the characters with PTSD in this series. Like, it just wouldn't be in keeping with the book. So like on the one hand, while I do love it when sort of like the author does give like diagnosis to a character, because like if it's something that I also have, I sort of feel validated and I feel that I can relate to that character and say, yes, that is like a good representation of this illness, without worrying that it might have been intending to sort of like be portraying a slightly different mental illness. But it has got to be sort of like suitable for the book and very fitting to the world building that you've already created. Because if it goes against the world building, that's just sort of like it's going to draw the reader out of the book and make them question that. And when I'm reading, I just want to be sort of like really lost in the story, because like I don't read for escapism, and that's why I write as well, partly as well. So I'd say it is like a fine balance, really.
Yeah. You make a really good point actually about the usefulness of labels, and I guess some people will say that labels aren't important, but actually I don't think I agree with that. I necessarily. I think that kind of labeling our experiences is how you find how you find other people with the same experiences to an extent, and is how we kind of construct our kind of narrative of ourselves and our world and our lives. And I think that actually I hadn't actually considered that, but it's a really good point that somebody who maybe had those experiences but just thought that they were on their own, or that they were just mad, or there was something wrong with them, being sort of introduced to the concept that actually that there might be a name for what they're experiencing, could be a really important moment for them. So thank you for that.
But I know when I got like diagnosed with OCD, and like just sort of like being told that this was what I had and being given that label made me feel really sort of validated in my experiences, and it also made me feel that like the suffering that I was going through was recognized, and it made me feel just so much less alone, and it did sort of like open up the whole community as well, because then I then felt like able to join these OCD support groups as well, which really helped. And just finding other people and knowing that you're not alone, just like what you were saying, that's just such a big part. So I think that if I'm writing sort of another speculative fiction story, really sort of like about a mental illness, I'm going to need to sort of like build into the world building a way to sort of acknowledge that this is the illness that this person has, especially if it's a really central to the storyline. But on the other hand, like I know that like, wow, I want to write about OCD in a more speculative fiction story, because like at the moment I'm working on a young adult thriller that is got the main character with OCD. And I do really want to write sort of like a dystopian story, because like as you were saying with yours, like contamination OCD is just like a nightmare in like a dystopian world. And I think that would be like really interesting to explore. And it is something that I did start to explore before, but because it was so close to my own experiences, I just found it so triggering writing it. At that point when I was trying to write it, I had severe OCD. I hadn't yet been able to start treatment, and my OCD is also slightly different from like regular. Well, I say regular, but there's no sort of like regular mental illness anyway. But mine's caused by brain inflammation, so mine has got like a physiological cause.
Okay.
Because my brain inflammation means that my basal ganglia part of the brain is permanently like inflamed at the moment in this chronic state of inflammation due to my immune system against it. And because that part of the brain is responsible for habit formation and emotion control, I mean, it also affects the parts that are like there to sense danger. That is like why I had developed OCD. So, and yeah, when I was like trying to write this dystopian story that was like really all about OCD, I just found it was too close to my own personal experiences, and I was just getting too bogged down. It was just too challenging. Every time when I started writing it, I just felt like really, really sort of like on edge, and I just felt like it was making my own mental illness worse. I had to be really sort of mindful of that. And like in a way, because I'm writing a thriller now, which is like a contemporary setting, I have found that easier to write for the ACD, because like on the one hand, I suppose it's more sort of linked to my own personal experiences, and I'm not sort of like worrying about these dystopian like world building conditions that aren't actually going to affect me. But yeah, I just get really into a character's mindset. So is there anything that you struggle with when writing sort of mental health?
I suppose, yeah, I think I have a fairly good idea of how to look after myself when I'm writing difficult stuff, and I don't necessarily write things that are kind of aligned to my own experience. So I don't have OCD, I don't have PTSD. I think that certainly my experience, aspects of my own experience, find their way into my writing, and I think I certainly, in the process of writing Sparks, which is the sequel to Blackout, I found that in a way I was processing some stuff, some events that had kind of happened sort of in my own life. Not because I was writing about those experiences, but because I think because I was sort of addressing the kind of wider themes, if that makes sense, kind of particularly around sort of tolerating uncertainty, and this idea that we kind of feel like we have control of our lives, and then one day you start the day and your life looks one way, and at the end of the day your life looks very different, and how you kind of come to terms with that, and come to terms with the uncertainty of life. I think that actually it was quite a helpful thing being able to sort of explore that and process that through writing. But I think I kind of had to do it sort of at the right time. And if I had kind of said, right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a thing that sort of about how I feel and about how my experiences, I think I would have found that much harder, and like you say, and perhaps it wouldn't have been helpful. Perhaps it would have just been difficult. So I think what I find is that I don't necessarily set out to kind of reflect all of my own experience. I think that when I do come to it, I kind of come to it sort of naturally, sort of in my own time, and that makes it easier. And I think I do have a relatively kind of sort of finely honed kind of sense of when to sort of step away from something. So I was actually writing a couple of years back. I started writing a draft of a book. I got about 30,000 words in, and I was like, God, this is really good. This is one of the best things I've ever written. but God, it was making me really miserable. And I was just, I got sort of 30,000 words in. I was just like, I'm not enjoying this. This is like making me kind of, this is actually sort of making me unhappy coming back to this. And I just had to scrap the whole project in the end, because I just thought, this isn't good for me. This isn't kind of how I want to be spending my time and where I want to be kind of putting my head. So I think kind of knowing when to sort of, as you say, kind of knowing when to sort of walk away from something or is quite important.
It can just be so draining, and like if we're writing a book, we're going to be spending a lot of time in that place, and we've got to be sort of like mindful of our own well-being and mental health. So I see we've got a question on the live chat facility, so I'll just get that up on the screen. So regarding labels and diagnoses, whether you mention it in the text or not, do you start with a diagnosis in mind and try to write through that, or do you start with a character and perhaps apply a label afterwards? So this is a great question. Do you want to go first, Kit, or shall I?
You go for it. If you, yeah.
So I'm just thinking, like, when I was writing my Untamed series, like I knew from the start when I outlined it and before I even started writing that addiction was going to be sort of its main mental illness theme in it. And I wrote my main character with that already in mind. So that was sort of like formed sort of pretty much as the label, and then like, I wrote to that, and I did a lot of research about addiction and everything. So with that series and with that main character, I sort of very much started with the diagnosis in mind. But with one of the secondary characters, the one who goes on to develop PTSD, that sort of happened more naturally, and that sort of like arose as circumstances to the story. And it was only when I'd finished, I think it was like the second draft of the book, that I realised I'd actually written a character with PTSD. So then at that point, I then went and did loads more research about it. And I got a sensitivity reader as well who could read for sort of accurate representation, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't being sort of like harmful with like stereotypes or anything. And so then I sort of like shaped their behaviour more to sort of like reflect the PTSD. But I never actually sort of like said in the narrative that this character has PTSD. So I did kind of like avoid labelling them then, because I do worry if like I'm starting with a diagnosis and I'm writing a character specifically for that I could just make that character's like personality all about the mental health. And I think it's really important to show that that is only one part of them. But then on the other hand, I'm worried that if I'm then sort of like get a character and I decide, oh, they're going to have like this mental illness, and I'm then going to sort of apply it to them like as a layer, that it won't sort of like fit naturally or organically. So I think it's quite like a fine balance, and it's about being very much in tune to the story. Like, especially when I'm writing, I've got to feel that it is right. So, what about you then?
Yeah, so I don't think I have never kind of sat down and thought I want to write a book about a person with X diagnosis. I think, as you say, that my kind of understanding of what different characters kind of struggle with comes as I sort of get to know the characters, if that makes sense. So I think that for me, once I kind of understand somebody's sort of backstory and their kind of thought processes and the way they kind of respond to things, that then kind of evolves into so for I suppose thinking about kind of Mackenzie in Blackout and in the OCD, I didn't set out or sort of sit down thinking, right, like, I'm going to write this character and he is going to have OCD and I must make him kind of fit that. I think, I sort of knew his story, if that made sense. And from there, it made sense to me that he would have this kind of very strong sense of responsibility and this very high anxiety about uncertainty, about keeping people safe, about feeling that he was kind of to blame for certain things that had happened. And that then lent itself naturally to him kind of developing certain kind of behaviours and kind of thinking patterns to cope with that and to try to manage that, and that's kind of how it sort of evolved. I think in Sparks, the character who has again, I think what I feel kind of fairly comfortable with sort of labelling PTSD. I knew when I sat down to write it that she had PTSD, but I didn't kind of set out thinking I want to write a character with PTSD. It just made sense to me that she would have, based on what she had been through and how she had responded to it and how she'd kind of processed that. So does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you make a really good point about I think if you kind of start the other way around, then there's a danger of kind of trying to sort of shoehorn things in, or like you say, kind of making the character's sort of identity about that kind of one thing. Or sort of shaping the book to kind of fit that. And I don't. I'm not sure. For me, I don't think I would find that a helpful way to sort of write a character. So.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I know I kind of did that in a way, sort of like with the addiction part of my manuscript, because I knew that with the Untitled Chapter was going to be like this really big theme in the book. So I was just like, I was aware of that right before I started, but I wouldn't say that I sort of decided that the addiction was going to be sort of like the main part of that character. Like, although it's kind of, I was really mindful that I didn't want to be sort of like imposing sort of like on her if it didn't naturally fit. Because I think it's really important that like any mental illness you're writing, like regardless of whether you like know at the start that you're writing or if you apply it at the end, that you don't just think you can sort of like tap on the label of like this character has this and then just expect readers to believe it, because you need to sort of show that mental illness, it does affect a lot of different things, and it affects a lot of different ways that you do things. Sort of about integrating it seamlessly throughout the narrative, while also showing that it's not sort of a defining thing about this character. It's really important that you show that they've got like hopes and dreams and ambitions, and they've got hobbies and things they're good at, things they're not good at, their flaws, and you show that those are all separate to the mental illness, but that they are also affected by the mental illness. So it sounds like a bit of a contradiction, I suppose, but does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it's I think it's a dialectic, I think, rather than a contradiction. You know, it's kind of both and. You know, you kind of hold both together, if that makes sense. I think I think for me the most important thing about kind of writing, you know, any sort of character with any kind of difficulty is that I think that it makes sense in the context of their experience. You know, I personally, I don't think that people, I don't think that sort of I don't think that sort of mental health problems are just kind of one size, you know, that they just happen randomly. I think that they, you know, people develop certain ways of coping, certain behaviours, certain thought patterns, for you know, there's a reason that lead, you know, that there are a series of reasons that lead to that. I don't believe that it just kind of randomly happens one day. So I think it's really important to have an understanding of how your character has come to the place that they are in.
Because there is the whole like nature versus nurture debate about like sort of the origins of mental illness. So I think if you can incorporate that into like your character's background, then that sort of like adds this extra sort of like layer of authenticity if you're writing about mental illness. And particularly, like as we were saying, speculative fiction often has like, especially dystopians, they have like this really sort of like aggressive, vicious world building, and that is like a huge nurture factor for people developing illnesses. So yeah, it's important to sort of like root the illness and like be able to show like how it has developed. And how much research do you do sort of around mental health then for your characters? And like, how do you go about researching it?
Well, I've been a mental health nurse for the last 11 years, so my entire life is basically like research. So I'm really fortunate, I think, in that regard. In that I, you know, have been very privileged to be a part of a lot of people's journeys and hear a lot of accounts and a lot of kind of first-hand experiences of different sort of mental health problems. And I also have a professional responsibility to keep researching and keep learning, and keep kind of developing my own practice and my own understanding. And that, I think, has helped a lot and has made me kind of who I am, I think, as a writer. And I think I'm very conscious that it's not all about that. So, for example, I suppose in my day job, I have always had a kind of special interest in complex trauma, and it's something that I feel reasonably confident in saying that I know a lot about, and I still got sensitivity readers for my character with PTSD, because I think the second that you think you know everything about something, like I know a lot, but I don't know everything, and actually what that taught me was that there really is no kind of substitute for kind of lived experience. There were things, kind of subtleties that I had sort of not picked up on, or sort of was able to kind of expand further, or to kind of reflect on more with the feedback of the sensitivity readers. And so that's hugely valuable, I think. I think if I ever feel like there's something that I don't understand, I think I feel like as writers, I feel like we have a responsibility to make sure we do our research and to be accurate and to be honest in our depictions of things, particularly when we're writing things that we don't have first-hand experience of. It's a huge responsibility for all of the kind of reasons we spoke about earlier, and because of the kind of ongoing stigma around mental health. I think if we get it wrong, there's really sort of serious kind of real world kind of ramifications to that. So yeah.
Do you think the stigma has lessened around mental health then, sort of in sort of the time that we're living now compared to what it used to be sort of like 10-15 years ago?
I think it's kind of a difficult question. I feel like it's really dependent on kind of where you are and what kind of circles you move in, actually, because I feel like it would be really easy for me to kind of, because I work in mental health and I spend all my time around people who are fortunately understanding and have gone into this that field of work because they get it and they want to help people. And it would be easy for me to kind of say sort of blindly, I think there's very little stigma, but I think unfortunately that's not what I hear from many people that I work with. What I hear is that there is still a lot of stigma, a lot of fear about disclosing things openly, a lot of poor understanding still, a lot of worries about kind of being judged, a lot of judgment, and so I think things have got better. I think there's still a really long way to go. I mean, what's your experience? I mean, you've been living with some sort of, some of these difficulties. What's your experience being around stigma?
Yeah, so I found that stigma does seem to be quite like a generational thing. So I found like younger people are a lot more accepting of it, and particularly like when I use sort of like the word psychosis, I found that like although some like people of my generation have been like really wary of me and just like sort of said, "Oh, we're not going to talk to you now. You're too dangerous," like that kind of thing. I found I've sort of got that reaction a lot more from like older people, and I do wonder whether it's sort of like this like difference in education, because I know that we are talking a lot more about mental health now than we might have been sort of like 20, 30 years ago. So I do wonder whether that just sort of like means that sort of like today's young people and like the young adults that we're writing for, there's going to be sort of like less stigma and like, yeah, because like I know sort of it is quite a stereotype as well to say that like grandparents aren't sort of like tolerable of like mental illness because like they were raised in a society that encouraged them not to talk about it and it was kept very private and it wasn't really like a public thing. So I am really interested in sort of like how stigma varies depending on like generation and how it sort of like links into like public versus private sphere.
I think you're yeah, there is kind of, I mean, understanding of mental health and mental illness has come on so far. I think even in the last kind of 20-30 years, I think you know, it was really still very recent that there's some really kind of worryingly sort of archaic views around still. So, and I guess people can't know what they don't know. So, you know, people like you say of kind of sort of older generations who just have never had that kind of opportunity to sort of be educated or you know, about mental health. It's probably much harder to kind of get your head around. I think that in terms of, I mean, you mentioned earlier that kind of when you got your diagnosis, you hadn't seen kind of really any positive sort of representations of people with psychosis. You know, that it was kind of almost like a sort of byword for like, you know, bad guy. I think that kind of media representation, I think, has come on a lot. Since in the last kind of 20 years or so. I think that there's much more understanding of the impacts and much less tolerance of bad representation or lazy representation than there was, which is heartening. I think things are heading in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely, because like I know like when I was at university, I wrote my dissertation on the relationship between like mental illness and violence. So I was sort of like looking at how, especially like in the Victorian era, mental illness is also like synonymous for being violent, and that is you can really see sort of the progression and how like those two things aren't necessarily like associated strongly now, and I think that's really important to sort of like contributing towards breaking down the stigma around mental health, because like I was reading statistics the other day and it said like that people with that experience psychosis are more likely to be victims of violent crime than like the perpetrators of it. And I think that yeah, we just need to sort of like write about mental health in like a more positive way and show that it doesn't automatically mean the person is dangerous, because that only contributes towards the stigma if you're just like using mental illness as an excuse for violence in the story. And I think that's sort of like when I was like looking for representations of psychosis, and I was only finding them in like villains, and sort of, they were just sort of like using it as an excuse, and like that's like you'd have like this really violent villain who'd do like all these terrible things, and it was kind of like the author just thought, oh, I need a backstory for his character. Why are they behaving like that? And it kind of felt like psychosis was like an easy route for that author to take without having to like do too much thinking. And that only contributes towards like stereotypes, and as you know, like stereotypes are just so harmful with the stigma, and we do have real life consequences. Because that's something that you were saying earlier, and I definitely agree with, because like as authors we have this moral responsibility not to have like these harmful representations and harmful portrayals. And I know one question that I often get asked is like, as a writer, because I write about mental illness from like a first-hand perspective of OCD and psychosis, I often get asked like from authors that don't have any first-hand experience of the illness, like if they've got any tips about like how to do it in sort of like a way that isn't going to be harmful or dangerous or damaging at all. And yeah, like we've talked about sensitivity readers, and I just like think they are so important, because as you were saying, sort of like nothing can like replace sort of like first-hand experience and how important that is in a story. And yeah, I would also say that if you're writing sort of like a mentally ill character, like in a speculative fiction, like it's gonna sort of like hopefully not be sort of like the driving force of the book. I think if you're writing a story that is specifically about being mentally ill, you should maybe only do that if you've got like first-hand experience. Whereas like that comes up more in sort of like contemporary fiction, because like I know some publishers they only have sort of like a limited space for like these types of stories, and you wouldn't want to like tread on like an own voices book and like take up the space for. But at the same time, it's like saying that does risk meaning that people without these experiences aren't going to write mentally ill characters. And I think it's really important that they do. And we need to encourage them to write these mentally ill characters without being worried that they're taking up the space. I think it's just important to say, yeah, write mentally ill characters, but don't necessarily write solely about the experience of being mentally ill. And I think that's where it really writing mental illness in speculative fiction offers, because it won't be like the sole focus of the book, because speculative fiction has like all this amazing world building, but like all the fantasy and science fiction elements that come into it. So yeah, what are your views on all of that? I've just been rambling on.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, that I think in terms of tips for people who are writing outside of their own experience, I think the best tip I can give is just know that, be aware that you don't know what you don't know. Be aware that you have blind spots. Be aware that there are, that you may not know where the gaps in your experience are. That you need to kind of get as wide a perspective as possible to be able to accurately represent something and somebody's experience that's not your own. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. I don't think. I think that. I think that if everyone only wrote within the boundaries of their own experience, there would be much less diversity. That would be a really sad thing. But I think you'd be prepared for it to be much harder work, basically, and that's okay. I think but I think you have to kind of be prepared for it. And some people have a bit of a thing about sensitivity readers, don't they? But and which I do not understand. And it tends to be, I think, people who have no experience of marginalisation, who get all up in arms about the fact that, God forbid, you might actually ask somebody about their own lived experience of something. It's just research, basically, there's nothing wrong with that. So I think, sensitivity readers, more than one, ideally. I think, no one person can, God knows I'm not the spokesperson for the entire, lesbian community. You need to speak to different people and get different perspectives, and you also need to be aware of intersectionality and the way that different marginalizations, kind of interact with each other and intersect with each other and impacts on people's experiences. I think in terms specifically of writing about mental illness, I think a combination of talking to people about their kind of lived experience and doing some kind of clinical research can be really, really helpful. I think understanding things like the kind of the sort of cognitive models of different disorders and the kind of neurological processes. I would, if anybody who's writing a kind of traumatized, a character who's been through a significant trauma, this is the book that I would recommend. I feel like it should be mandatory reading for everybody who's writing about trauma. The Body Keeps the Score by it's The Body Keeps the Score by Basil van der Kolk. It's a textbook basically, but it's a really accessible one, and it talks both about the kind of neurological processes of trauma and kind of case studies and the sort of cognitive and behavioral aspects of it as well. So it's really excellent, and I think it can really help to sort of deepen sort of understanding on sort of multiple levels. So yeah, that would be my advice. I wanted to come on a little bit to what you said about kind of whether people should stay in their lane, essentially. I think you make a really good point about if you're kind of writing about an issue, if your book is about the experience of having a certain diagnosis or belonging to a certain kind of marginalized group, then I think you're right, actually, that does feel different to including a character who in a book that's not just centered on that. It's something about the centering of it that makes it different, I think. And where actually I think it would be very, very difficult to do the nuance of it justice if you didn't have that lived experience. And I think there is also something about taking up space, and you know, I don't want to get too controversial here, but I still think that there are barriers in publishing to people from marginalized groups, and it would be naive, not, although it's got much better, I think it would be naive to think that that's not the case, and that, you know, if you are, and that yeah, it's, we need to be, if we don't have those experiences, we have a responsibility to kind of be kind of lifting up the voices of people who do, and making sure that their stories are centered and celebrated. So
definitely, yeah. So I see we've got another question. So yeah, I'll just pop it on the screen now. So how do you integrate first-hand accounts of people who struggle with certain issues into your writing? Seems like there is a balance between the realism, remembering, and respecting privacy. So yeah, that is a great question. Do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. For myself, it's not that I think that once you have, for me, I think because I tend to have spoken to or worked with kind of lots of different people who've had a kind of a certain difficulty, a certain diagnosis, a certain experience, I think it's not just about kind of picking out one person's kind of narrative or one person's experience, and kind of writing that into a story. It's about kind of understanding what are the kind of common themes of that experience, you know, what are the common threads, and how do those apply to this character who has their own kind of backstory, their own history, their own their own narrative. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, because it's very much about sort of making it make sense for your own character and not the person who is providing you with this research.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah.
But I know when sort of I've when I've used sensitivity readers, it's always been at the point where I've got a complete draft, I've got like this character written, and it's kind of like I want the sensitivity readers' guidance in saying like which parts I've done wrong, or which parts need changing, which parts need developing more. So it doesn't like necessarily relate like perfectly to like the sensitivity reader's own experience, like individual, because like no one individual experience is going to be sort of like sum up like it for everyone in that group. So yeah, it's very much like I already have like my character formed and the experiences, and it's about sort of like asking sensitivity reader to help me make that more accurate, more like just try avoid stereotypes and avoid sort of like harmful representation. But I'm not sort of like directly lifting details from like sensitivity reader's life and putting it into my character, because like that wouldn't actually make sense for the story that I'd written or like the characters that I'd written, because everyone is just so different. So yeah, and like you were saying, it's like it's really important to use multiple sensitivity readers as well. So because you can't have like you say like, oh, the story is absolutely fine for representation because one person has checked this and therefore it's okay for everyone, because that's not how things work. Like mental illness is very individual, and I think like the more you read about it and read first-hand experiences, and if you just like build up this wealth of information, then you can write a character like fairly well with really good like mental health representation, and it won't really be sort of like lifting like really personal details from like these people's lives that you've researched, but you should still ask the sensitivity readers to check your representation if you're not part of that marginalised group with like having that mental illness.
Yeah, so. No, absolutely. I think, I mean, when I had sensitivity readers for the PTSD storyline, I didn't know what their trauma was. I didn't need to know. That's literally none of my business. But it's not about that. It's about things like, you know, does this description of how it feels to have a flashback does this make sense? You know, is this and as you say, ultimately, is it, you know, have I cocked up massively anywhere? Have I accidentally written something that is massively offensive or harmful or just plain wrong, you know? And yeah, I think it's never about taking other people's stories and working them into your own writing. Certainly not for me. Yeah,
because I always make sure that part where I'm like looking for a sensitivity reader, I've already got like complete story, complete character, because like I'm getting a sensitivity reader to check what I have written, not to form a character who is exactly like them, because we are not entitled to like know these details about their lives just because they're a sensitivity reader who are offering their services to authors. There are still those boundaries. So yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you for that. Do you think there are any sort of topics or any sort of areas that people should just blanket avoid or just should never go near?
I'm going to say stereotypes, because if you're writing a stereotype, like it is going to be harmful and like it is going to be damaging. So like going back to the example of like writing a villain who has psychosis, like I would say just please avoid that. But if you have to do it, then make sure that they're not the only character with psychosis. Also, like write other characters with psychosis to show that psychosis doesn't mean that you're a bad person. So yeah, like I just like really suggest sort of like avoiding stereotypes, and then like almost write the opposite of a stereotype in a way, because I think that can be like really helpful, just like for you as a writer, like understanding like what your preconceived ideas are about a mental illness, because then it allows you to sort of, like examine why you think this, where this is sort of originated from, and a lot of it is wrapped up in like ideology in society and sort of like the representations that we see in popular culture. But yeah, just like if you're writing mental illness into characters just to make them seem more evil, definitely avoid that. So yeah, what about you? What about you? Are there any things that you say to avoid?
I think I don't think there is any. I wouldn't say there is anything to blanket avoid. I would say that the most important thing to do is examine your motivations for including a character with a specific sort of condition or difficulty, and if that motivation is I need a reason for them to behave inexplicably, or I think this will make them cool and interesting, just don't fucking do it. Sorry about the swearing, but just like that's like the biggest like thing, I think. Just think about why you want that character to to have that representation, that aspect of their personality. I think as you say that there's always a reason for behavior, but so the idea that kind of you can just make somebody mad and that can be the reason they're a bad guy is just lazy. That there is, it doesn't make any sense. If you're writing I think just make sense. Just make sure that your characters, whatever your character does, whatever they experience, make sense in the context of them as a whole person. And I think sometimes I think be aware of the stereotypes and so for example, I suppose contamination OCD is probably the most well-known kind of manifestation of OCD, and that is a kind of aspect of my character's kind of difficulties. And for me, that made sense because of the experiences that he'd been through, and the fact that he'd kind of gone through this sort of living in this world where there was no access to kind of clean water or medicine, and people had died as a result of that. And so for me, it made sense that he would become really preoccupied with contamination. But if you were just writing that because that's what you know about OCD, then don't do that.
Exactly. The type of OCD I have is actually contamination, like that's opposite of the OCD, and like linking into this with like how sort of like mental illnesses are sort of like formed and what contributes to it. I was just thinking in sort of like the present scenario with the COVID-19 pandemic, you are seeing a lot more people engaging in like these behaviors that are typical for contamination OCD. Because like when like I had it really badly, I was washing my hands like 60, 70 times a day to the point where my hands were bleeding. Like I couldn't make a fist without my hands, like the skin splitting open and bleeding, and like my hands were so swollen. I've now got like joint problems with my fingers from like all the damage that I did, and I've got like arthritis in 2 of my fingers as well now. And one thing I have noticed is the pandemic, it has like brought out those like feelings of the OCD and like the fear of contamination in me a lot more. So I am sort of like navigating more closely back to those behaviors. But I'm seeing these behaviors arising in a lot more people around me. Like obviously at a much less level, because OCD is a severe anxiety disorder where it becomes sort of like debilitating and you can't sort of like manage everyday life. But I have been quite interested because I've seen these OCD behaviors around me in people that did not have OCD. So I think that is like it's a really good like way of seeing how the environment that you're living in can contribute towards mental illness. Because like I wonder how after this pandemic is like has gone, whether we're going to see like everyone sort of like continuing to engage in these sort of like safety behaviors of like hand washing excessively and sanitizing, and whether we're going to find a lot more people like suddenly developing sort of more anxiety disorders and more OCD because of this environment. So.
Yeah, I do. I do wonder about that. And actually, I think that certainly something that's very much in my mind. And you're absolutely right. It's a really good example of how how our experiences, how the world we live in shapes our thinking and our behaviour, and changes that, and what becomes normal and what becomes abnormal, and so. Yeah, I think take note, sort of aspiring writers who are wanting to kind of include mental health representation. This is in some ways a kind of learning opportunity. But I think you're right. I think it's impossible to say at this point what the kind of long-term sort of ramifications are going to be, in sort of people's kind of collective mental health. But I think there absolutely will be huge, like a huge impact for many people, and sort of across wider society. Sorry, it's a slightly grim note, a foreboding note to send out there.
Yeah. Should we talk about like which books we recommend for good examples of mental health representation, specifically in speculative fiction? So, would you like to go first on this one?
Yeah. So, we had a bit of a chat beforehand, didn't we, about how a lot of there's a lot of really good rep in kind of contemporary fiction, but there is some awesome representation in spec fic. So the author F.D. Lee has a series and a standalone novel. Standalone is a sci-fi novel, and although her character doesn't have a diagnosis, he definitely has a lot of issues and things that he's struggling with. And I would say that is a really excellent representation of somebody who is struggling with a lot of different things to do with their kind of identity and their place in the world, and sort of psychological impact of that on him. I think is just phenomenally well done. I think in terms of YA, Out of the Blue by Sophie Cameron is really good. That has a really I think a really sort of resonant kind of depiction of traumatic grief in the main character. I think is really well done. And interesting, graphic novel wise, have you read The Wicked and the Divine?
No, I haven't, but I've heard so many good things about it. So
it's so good. But I think they do. I think they do mental health representation really, really well. And the central character in the first 2 volumes is a teenager. This girl called Laura, and she again, I think, very clearly kind of goes through sort of depressive episodes, and there's sort of references to her going to therapy and things like that, which is quite refreshing because you don't often get that in YA. And although it's not about her mental health does kind of feature in it, and it impacts on her storyline. And I think it's really well done. And it was really interesting to see that in a graphic novel context where you don't get, it's very light touch because you don't get so much of the kind of the description of the inside of people's heads, but it still, for me, was very kind of evocative and felt very real and very relatable. So yeah, how about you?
Yeah, so most of the books I've been reading recently have been YA thrillers and like psychological thrillers, because that is what I'm currently working on, and I am currently working on representation within that genre. So yeah, from like a contemporary point of view, Winter Girls by Laurie Halse is like an amazing book, because like you've got like different eating disorders in it, you've got anxiety, depression, and that really shows like how mental illnesses sort of don't exist in isolation, because you do often get like several overlapping, even like in one person. And I really think that is great representation, and it shows how it is, how sort of like the main character's mental illness, and because like in this case it's like an eating disorder, but it's very much linked to like self-esteem and sort of like confidence issues as well. And it really sort of like shows mental illness doesn't sort of exist in isolation, and it affects every part of her life. Similarly, another like, it's another contemporary story again, because like it's mainly what I've been reading, but Cracked Up to Be by Courtney Summers is just like, it's really good sort of examination of depression, and you've got like suicidal like imagery in it and suicidal ideation, and you've got like a lot of really strong mental health representation, but it's not like the sole focus of the book, because you've also got like this, you've got a lot of like guilt examined in it, like blame, how that then can like lead into anxiety disorders. But at the same time, mental illness isn't like the huge focus of the book. It's very much like a sort of like thriller as well. So I think like that is just so well done. But yeah, back to speculative fiction, because that's what I'm supposed to be talking about, and I'm just rambling. My friend Elsie Anderson writes an amazing science fiction. It's like a science fiction comedy, but it also touches on mental health. So it's a Star Trek saga in the first book. Like the main character suffers from depression, and it was so well done, and it was really refreshing to see sort of like this comedy, because like the book is science fiction. It's got some really funny moments in it. It's really light-hearted humor, but it also deals with like really sort of what would typically be considered like a heavy thing, like depression, and it's just really well done. And I really love how she in particular shows that you can talk about depression in a light-hearted way as well, without taking the seriousness out of it, because it's really, it sounds a bit weird like when I'm describing it like this, like I don't think I'm doing a great job of it, but you've got like this balance, and yeah, like she just maintains that really well, and that actually like throughout the series, and she just shows how depression isn't this thing that is just like cured one day and you'll never sort of like encounter it again. Like it does like sort of like ebb and flow, and it's very much linked to what the character is going through, like in the environment around her. So I think that that is a really good depiction of mental health in speculative fiction.
Oh, I'll definitely have to look that. Definitely have to look that one up. That sounds really good. So I'm always on the lookout for recommendations. I'm just like looking at my bookshelves to see if I've missed anything. You mentioned Winter Girls by Laurie Halse, and yeah, I mean, I read Speak when I was a teenager, and it was just really, I don't think I'd ever really read anything like it at the time. I think she's a phenomenal contemporary writer, and really, I think sort of back kind of 20 years ago when Speak came out, I think it was quite sort of groundbreaking, really, because there really wasn't a lot out there that was like it. So yeah, definitely seconding vote for her. I think she's she's a really excellent writer.
Great. So yeah, we're actually coming up to the end of the time now. So should we wrap up, like sort of summarizing the most important things that we would like viewers to take away? So yeah, for me it is if you're writing mental illness into a book, like that's great. But yeah, as you were saying, think about motivations while you're doing it, and be wary of stereotypes. And if you find yourself writing stereotypes, change it, because what you're writing will have real consequences, and you don't want to be putting out a harmful representation that is only going to contribute towards the stigma that we are trying to dismantle through writing about mental health in speculative fiction and in YA and in fiction in general. So yeah, that's like my advice, is to be wary of stereotypes, and if you think yourself writing one, change it. And sensitivity readers are just so important if you don't have first-hand experience. So yeah, that's all, like my little summary based on our discussion. So is there anything you'd like to add, Kit?
Yeah, I'm horrible about these summaries, but I think to summarize, to be bold in your in your writing of your characters, your understanding of characters in your representation. Be brave. Take risks, but do your research to go with it. I think coming back to that dialectic again of sort of, I think don't be afraid to kind of step outside of your experience, and because that is like the beauty of fiction, but also be mindful that comes with a really big responsibility when you're talking about kind of real things that affect real humans, and take that responsibility seriously. Don't just write bad guys with mental health problems just for the sake of it. I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, that is hugely important. Yeah, so do you want to just say a bit about where people can find Blackout if they want to read it? So
thank you. Yes, you can find Blackout on Amazon. It is available on Kindle or as an actual book. And the Kindle book is 99p, so it's relatively good value. So that's where you can find Blackout if you're interested. How about you? Where can we find yours?
Yeah, so mine are like on Amazon, like major retailers. Obviously bookshops are closed at the moment because of the pandemic, so yeah, sort of like limited to online. But yeah, libraries as well. I've had a lot of them offering like ebook lending services now, like if they weren't already. So that's a really good opportunity. So yeah. Oh, and here is my book as well. I've just picked up the cover. So yeah, I love showing off my cover. So little opportunity.
Yeah, it's a really good cover. It's really nice.
Thank you. Yeah, this is the second edition of it as well. So this is the UK cover. It was designed by Molly Phipps. So yeah, little shout out for her there. So yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, Kit. And like this has been such a great conversation about mental health and speculative fiction. And yeah, it's just really interesting talking like to another writer about it all. And like it's always just I learn so much from like every conversation I do with other writers. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And as you say, I've really learned a lot from talking to you, and it's been a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been awesome.